And we are back, folks, in Jerusalem. This is the Jerusalem Minute on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS, along with Alex Traiman, the CEO of JNS. We are in the heartland of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, our capital city. Alex, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, yes.
Top story in Israel this week, I think without a doubt, is Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, calling for Israeli elections, getting involved in internal Israeli politics. And let's go ahead and roll the clip on Chuck Schumer. Here are his remarks.
In order to achieve a two-state solution, the reality is that things must change. Right now, there are four major obstacles standing in the way of two states. And until they are removed from the equation, there will never be peace in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. The four major obstacles are Hamas and the Palestinians who support and tolerate their evil ways, radical right-wing Israelis in government and society, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The fourth major obstacle to peace is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has all too frequently bowed to the demands of extremists like Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the settlers in the West Bank. I also believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his way by allowing his political survival to take the precedence over the best interests of Israel. He has put himself in coalition with far-right extremists like Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and as a result, he has been too willing to tolerate the civilian toll in Gaza, which is pushing support for Israel worldwide to historic lows. Israel cannot survive if it becomes a pariah. Prime Minister Netanyahu has also weakened Israel's political and moral fabric through his attempts to co-opt the judiciary, and he has shown zero interest in doing the courageous and visionary work required to pave the way for peace even before this present conflict. As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past. Nobody expects Prime Minister Netanyahu to do the things that must be done to break the cycle of violence, to preserve Israel's credibility on the world stage, and to work towards a two-state solution. If he were to disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and kick them out of his governing coalition, that would be a real meaningful step forward. But regrettably, there's no reason to believe Prime Minister Netanyahu would do that. He won't disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in their calls for Israelis to drive Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank. He won't commit to a military operation in Rafah that prioritizes protecting civilian life. He won't engage responsibly in discussions about a day-after plan for Gaza and a longer-term pathway to peace.
So there you have it. Schumer calling for Israeli elections to replace Prime Minister Netanyahu. He called him one of the four obstacles to peace, along with, imagine this, comparing Netanyahu to Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, also saying that the right-wing Israelis are obstacles to peace. Comments were met with pushback from Republicans and even some members of the Democratic Party. Your take on Chuck Schumer this week?
Well, first of all, in Israel, we've had 5 elections in the last 5 years. And you can argue that Netanyahu won all 5 of them, right? In the 4th election, he was replaced for a couple minutes by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. But even in that election, he had beaten Lapid by 13 seats, which was basically a landslide, and only was replaced temporarily because of parliamentary maneuvers. So Israelis have picked who they want their leaders to be. And we're in the middle of a war here. The idea that your ally is going to turn around to a Democratic ally in the middle of a war when all these elections were what caused the divisiveness in the country that gave signal to our enemies that we were vulnerable, that they would then again call for an election and to happen now in the middle of the war. I think it's unconscionable, and it received very, very strong pushback around the board. Not just Republicans, not just some Democrats that are pro-Israel, but also even Netanyahu's own opponents, including Benny Gantz, who's in the war cabinet, and Naftali Bennett, who replaced Netanyahu briefly just over a year ago. They all came out and they said you cannot interfere in the democratic electoral politics of an ally.
So number one, he said that he claims that many Israelis have lost confidence in the vision and the direction of their government. That's number one. And even going a step further, he said that the United States will have no choice but to play a more active role in shaping Israeli policy. I mean, if this is not the epitome of chutzpah, then I don't know what is.
Well, this is the scary part here, because it's not just calls for Netanyahu to be replaced. And we have seen a steady stream of attacks on Netanyahu over the past several weeks. We've talked about it in this program. You have a lot of anonymous reports of Biden calling Netanyahu an a-hole or a bad effing guy. You had Hillary Clinton saying that Netanyahu is not trustworthy. Here they're getting right to the point, and this is clear that Schumer is an extension of the Biden administration, saying that that you need to have elections. But the forbearing comment that you just alluded to is that if the United States doesn't get what they want here, if they don't see Netanyahu replaced, if they don't see settler violence, as they call it, reined in, and maybe we'll talk about that later, that they may very well condition future aid to Israel, future support for the Jewish state, on the basis of moves that Israel makes. So they're making it very clear that they're the big brother in their relationship. Israel needs to do what America says, and it's really going to be up to Netanyahu to push back.
So let me get this straight. They're not calling for the removal of the leader of Iran. They're not calling for the removal of the leader of North Korea, China. You take your pick. All countries in the world that have much worse human rights records than the state of Israel. You're talking about a democratically elected prime minister of the state of Israel. We've had numerous elections. Netanyahu's come out on top. And yet still, you have another country, even though they're our best friends and the American people overwhelmingly support the state of Israel, you have a government here that is trying to get involved in internal politics.
You don't have the U.S. government saying we demand the immediate surrender of Yahya Sinwar and the rest of the Hamas leadership. They're not saying that. They're not saying that Mahmoud Abbas, who is in year 19 of his 4-year term, that he would resign, okay, or that there would be an election. And why aren't they calling for an election in the Palestinian Authority? Because they know that if there was an election, that Hamas would win that election. The only reason why they're calling for an election is because they're misreading the Israeli electoral map, and they think that somehow or another that if there would be an election, that they would get somebody to the left of Netanyahu to be the prime minister, it's really absurd, because this is a right-wing country that's moving further right after October 7th. So they really don't understand what's going on politically in Israel. And the other thing is that if they think that they're weakening Netanyahu, even their enemies are warning the Americans to stop it, and they say that they are in fact strengthening Netanyahu. You had Amit Segal wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, said that. You had Gil Troy, you had Chaviv Retek Gor. Those two specifically have been railing against Netanyahu for years, and they said that the Americans simply don't understand what's going on, that they, by doing this, are making Netanyahu into a hero, and they're making him much, much stronger, making it actually harder to get Netanyahu out of office.
No, for sure. A lot of pundits have said it, as you mentioned. I mean, they're giving him a lifeline, because the Israeli people, when they see people from the outside trying to get involved in our internal politics, even if they're not fans of who's running the country, we sort of unite when others from abroad try to have their say. Netanyahu, of course, responded to Senator Schumer, and let's listen to the Prime Minister's remarks.
בוקר טוב. מאז תחילת המלחמה אנחנו נלחמים בשתי חזיתות, בחזית הצבאית ובחזית המדינית. בחזית המדינית הצלחנו עד היום לאפשר לכוחותינו להילחם באופן חסר תקדים במשך 5 חודשים מלאים. אבל אין זה סוד שהלחצים הבינלאומיים נגדנו מתגברים. בקהילה הבינלאומית יש מי שמנסים לעצור את המלחמה עכשיו, לפני השגת כל יעדיה. הם עושים זאת על ידי הטחת האשמות שווא נגד צה"ל, נגד ממשלת ישראל ונגד ראש ממשלת ישראל. הם עושים זאת על ידי מאמץ להביא לבחירות עכשיו בעיצומה של המלחמה. ואת זה הם עושים, כי הם יודעים שבחירות עכשיו יעצרו את המלחמה וישתקו את המדינה לפחות ל6 חודשים. אז שיהיה ברור, אם נפסיק את המלחמה עכשיו, לפני השגת כל יעדיה, המשמעות היא שישראל הפסידה במלחמה. ואת זה לא נאפשר. לכן אסור לנו להיכנע ללחצים הללו, ולא ניכנע להם. להפך, האמת הפשוטה הזאת רק מחזקת את הנחישות שלנו להדוף את הלחצים ולהמשיך להילחם עד הסוף, עד הניצחון המוחלט. שום לחץ בינלאומי לא יעצור אותנו לממש את כל מטרות המלחמה. חיסול החמאס, שחרור כל חטופינו, ולהבטיח שעזה לא תהווה עוד איום נגד ישראל. כדי לעשות זאת, נפעל גם ברפיח. זאת הדרך היחידה לחסל את שארית גדודי המרצחים של החמאס, וזאת הדרך היחידה להפעיל את הלחץ הצבאי הדרוש לשחרור כל חטופינו. לשם כך, אישרנו את התוכנית המבצעית לפעולה ברפיח, לרבות קידום הצעדים לפינוי האוכלוסייה האזרחית מאזורי הקרבות.
So again, Prime Minister Netanyahu vowing to continue the fight against Hamas, including an operation in Rafah. We've been talking about it for several weeks now. I know yesterday there was an important meeting with the heads of the War Committee and the Security Cabinet talking about the future of the war. Netanyahu also saying that it is no secret international pressure is increasing against the state of Israel. However, he said that his positions, and people need to know this, his positions aren't his personal positions. They represent the will of the state of the people of the state of Israel who want to continue the war until the 3 goals are met. Hamas is removed from Gaza, the hostages are returned, and Gaza no longer poses a threat, and he remains committed at this point to those 3 goals.
You know, it was really interesting. I was reading a report in the Times of Israel by their founding editor, David Horowitz, and he makes no bones about his hatred of Netanyahu in every single piece that he writes. And then he goes on to talk about the policies of the IDF and how clever are the policies of the IDF during the war and how they're all working. Those are Netanyahu's policies, right? So there's no disagreements, major disagreements between how the defense establishment wants to handle the war, how Netanyahu wants to handle the war, how the people of Israel think the war should be handled, and how Netanyahu is handling the war. And by all accounts, I mean, it's very sad when we hear about soldiers being lost in the war, and we just heard about another soldier who was kidnapped on October 7th, who was just declared dead. That was Daniel Peretz, whose father, Doron, is the head of the World Zionist Organization. You know, very, very sad. But most Israelis feel like the war is being handled in a very efficient and appropriate way. And that's a credit to the prime minister. He has actually united the country around this war effort.
Again, after the war, you know, there'll be talk. There'll be obviously commissions and whatnot, but we are still at war. People need to remember this. And Netanyahu made this point yesterday, turning his attention to the international community. He said, "Is your memory so short? Did you forget so quickly October 7th, the most terrible massacre committed against the Jews since the Holocaust?" Because it seems that people are turning away from Israel and are supporting Hamas, favoring Hamas. You know, it's absolutely absurd, abhorrent that we're in this reality right now where we're being picked on by our best friends and by a lot of people in the international community who have had enough war when our goals have not yet been realized. And Israel's committed to fulfilling those goals.
And I think it's important also to look at the points of the criticism, because there are several major points that come up over and over again. It's a theme. On the one, the United States, the international community is criticizing Israel over what they call civilian casualties. So we talked about civilian casualties, but it's very important to know, again, and John Spencer actually talked about this in a great interview with Carolyn Glick this week, that Israel has done more than any military in the history of modern warfare to reduce civilian casualties. And this comes in an environment where Hamas hides itself, its weapons, and its tunnel shafts among civilian infrastructure. So, you know, and as Prime Minister Netanyahu said last week, he said on television, he said, "For us, every civilian killed is a tragedy. And for Hamas, every civilian killed is a strategy." Okay, so they're trying to they're trying to get Israel to kill as many civilians as possible. Meanwhile, Israel's done less than and more than any other country in the history of modern warfare to reduce civilian casualties. The second is humanitarian aid. Okay, they say that more humanitarian aid has to get into Gaza, that Israel's not doing anything to bring in humanitarian aid. Israel's going to extraordinary lengths to bring humanitarian aid in constantly. And the problem is what happens to the aid when it gets inside Gaza. The third is that they don't want Israel to go into Rafah. Okay, that's their quote-unquote red line, which it seems as though Netanyahu says the IDF is going to blow through that red line. They're going to attack Rafah. Why don't they want Israel to attack Rafah? Because if they don't, they say it's to reduce civilian casualties. But what the prime minister is saying is if you don't go into Rafah, then you don't get the remaining 6 Hamas battalions. And that means that the war is not over, that you have not finished Hamas off, which means that every single one of the soldiers that has died fighting will have died in vain because the war will not be finished. And the fourth is the creation of a Palestinian state. They think that the right answer to October 7th would be to reward the Palestinians and separate the whole concept of peace from statehood and to give them the reward and to give terrorists all over the world the message that if you attack your enemy with terrorism, that you will be rewarded with your diplomatic war aims.
Israel withdraws from Gaza 2005. What do we get in return? October 7th, Israel signs the Oslo Accords, turns large areas over to the Palestinian Authority. What do we get then? The Second Intifada. Every time Israel turns over pieces of land to our enemies or those who are claiming they want peace, and when they're secretly still paying terrorists to go out and murder Israelis, we get more and more terror, more and more Jewish blood being spilled.
So I think that Netanyahu he's been very gracious until now, accepting smack in the face after smack in the face. It's clear that the attacks have become intolerable. It's gotten to the point where it can no longer be ignored. There's no other cheek to turn at this point, so to speak. And Netanyahu has spoken up. He's speaking back, and I think that the Biden administration is actually awaking a sleeping lion. And I think that you're going to start to see now Netanyahu at a different level, at a much more combative level. And I would believe that you might start seeing Netanyahu dropping more what we'd call truth bombs on the U.S. administration. For example, that it was American foreign policy over the last several years, including the funding of Iran. 93% of Hamas's military budget comes from Iran. And Hezbollah and the Houthis are all funded by Iran. At the same time, pushing Israel towards ceding land for a Palestinian state. That these two things, also supporting Muslim Brotherhood, whether that's in Egypt, whether it's Turkey, all these things are destabilizing the region. I think that you might start seeing Netanyahu being a lot more combative with the Americans moving forward.
So as Chuck Schumer, I guess they're representing the government in the United States, goes after our prime minister. At the same time, once again, you have Biden administration sanctions levied against groups of so-called settlers, residents of Judea and Samaria. This is the second time in as many months that the U.S. State Department, in coordination with the U.S. Treasury, has sanctioned, in this case, specific individuals, 3 male individuals, residents of Judea and Samaria. In addition, 2 out of the 3, the government has sanctioned their properties, claiming that they are bases of terrorism, so to speak, against local Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria. So going after Netanyahu and now going after individuals. And what we've said before is that there's no end to how far this can go. And basically what we're talking about here is anyone who opposes, whether you're a civilian, whether you live in Judea and Samaria, perhaps a soldier or a government leader, anyone is susceptible to being sanctioned by the U.S. government if you don't support these policies, including a so-called two-state solution. And at the same time, what happens is that the Israeli banks are afraid. So they go along with what the U.S. does in terms of sanction, and they freeze the accounts of these individuals. A lot of these people have never even been arrested here in Israel. Another example of the United States getting involved in internal Israeli issues, in this case police issues or potential police issues, but the U.S. getting involved. And we had here, I spoke this week to Mark Zell, actually, who's a prominent international attorney, who said that this was a very significant step by the Biden administration in the negative light. And he's actually leading a group of attorneys who are going to court, to federal court in the United States. They're filing a civil case against the EO, the executive order, which was brought about on February the 1st by the Biden administration against these individuals in Judea and Samaria. And the bottom line here is it's not a one-time thing. It didn't happen once. It's already happened twice. And who knows how many times this can happen over and over, where assets are frozen because of where people live, Jews basically, because of their geography. And at the same time, by the way, even though the executive order says that it could be applied to both Arabs and Jews, so far only Jews have been targeted.
Yeah, you see the United States, didn't sanction UNRWA, right, which has been inciting to terrorism systematically, with thousands upon thousands of employees, that the United States has been looking for ways to move around the Taylor Force Act, which forbids the United States from moving money over to the Palestinian Authority when it knows that the Palestinian Authority has on its books a very large program to financially motivate individuals to commit acts of terror. And
pay for slay.
Yeah. And so here they're just cherry-picking little individuals that, as you mentioned, have not been convicted of crime. So there's no due process here. You have anti-Israel NGOs in this country and here in Israel that are compiling lists of individuals. They are colluding with the U.S. government, and then the U.S. government is applying these sanctions. And this is a slippery slope. And I spoke to Ron Dermer a couple of weeks ago in the Defense Ministry. He's a member of the War Cabinet. He was Israel's former ambassador to the United States. He's the Minister of Strategic Affairs, and he's in charge of the diplomatic relationship between Israel and the United States even today. And he said that they have a big problem over this with the United States. The question is, how big is the problem? They're waiting for a clarification. This is a complete violation of due process in this country. It's ironic because they're basically saying that the Israeli judicial system has no teeth to it. And yet, when Netanyahu wanted to change the judicial system in the summer, they got involved and they said, no, leave the judicial system exactly the way it is. And the question is, what can Israel do to stop this? And I don't think that the Israeli government has figured it out yet. So they better get on the ball, because as you're beginning to see, this is a pattern. And until Israel figures out what leverage it has to put a stop to this movement, you're going to see more and more sanctions coming up against Israeli citizens.
And more leaders here in Israel calling on the Netanyahu government to come up with a plan to figure out a way to stop the United States from sanctioning individuals based on their geography in Israel.
And one of the interesting things which I saw from Knesset member Simcha Rothman, who lives in a Pnei Kedem, which is one of these outposts that you're talking about. It's the pretty not inside one of the major settlement blocks. It's far out there. And he said that he tweeted that there's been more attacks against individuals in the United States for being Jewish than there have been by any of these so-called settlers that have attacked Palestinians, not to mention that there are also reports coming out, even the IDF has reported, that the overwhelming majority of the attacks reported by these left-wing NGOs that are colluding with the U.S. government were not attacks at all. And in many cases, the so-called attacks occurred after individuals were being attacked by Palestinians, so acts of terror in the response. So now all of a sudden the response is an act of settler violence and that's the whole story, which is the Palestinian strategy, which is it all started when he hit me back.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A Knesset subcommittee met this past week and the police were there and they acknowledged publicly that it was 50% or if not more cases of so-called acts of settler violence actually were made up, completely fabricated by these anarchists and extremists who come to the state of Israel and arrive at these communities. I know this for a fact every single week, especially on Shabbat, when people are trying to enjoy the quiet of the Sabbath and instigate. And then, of course, they're ready with their video cameras when the Jews defend themselves. So we see this time and time again, or, as I just mentioned, or completely fabricated stories.
And now the entire international community thinks that there's some kind of this moral equivalency between Palestinian terrorists, which are in the thousands and thousands, so many attacks, so many Jews losing their lives, versus a handful of individuals where you have the majority of the cases being completely fabricated. And it really affects Israel in a horrible way. And I wonder what it is also that Israel can do. to sanction these organizations that are causing tremendous diplomatic damage to the state of Israel.
No doubt something must be done. Alex, I don't know. Have you ever seen that deck of cards with the terrorists' pictures on them? Have you ever seen one of those?
Yeah, there's a small print of cards that have Hamas leaders on the face of the cards.
Right. So I don't know what this guy was, and I'm talking about Hamas's number 3, which Israel was able to liquidate. I don't know if he's the king of spades, but he's one of the top Hamas leaders. His name is Marwan Issa. He was killed in an Israeli airstrike targeting Hamas leaders in Gaza on March the 9th. Khan News reported on Sunday, citing Arab sources. They went back and forth. Was he killed? Was he not killed? It looks like Israel did achieve what it set out to do in targeting Hamas's number 3. Of course, that means we have, I guess, the ace of spades left, and I don't know if you call it the joker or one of the other aces, but you do have number 1 and number 2 who still remain calling the shots there for Hamas. But this was a significant strike by the government of the state of Israel, taking out a top Hamas leader.
Yeah, Israel has said that the top leadership of Hamas are dead men walking. Both inside Gaza and those that are abroad. Remember that much of the senior leadership of Hamas is currently in Qatar. That includes Khalid Mashal and Ismail Haniyeh. But the top 3 inside the Gaza Strip are Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, and here Issa. And it looks like they've taken Issa out. I was in the command and control center of the war along the Gazan border, and they have a poster with the 50 top leaders of Hamas, and the ones that have killed are X'd out. So they know exactly who they're going after, and Issa here looks like he has met his maker, and Israel's not going to stop until they get to the rest.
One by one, folks, Israel's coming for Hamas, and we're going to get every
and
last
I've heard,
one of them.
I've heard from various sources that Yahya Sinwar is afraid of losing his life, and that's why he's been on the run. You don't see him out and about fighting in the front lines. Definitely hiding in the tunnels. These Hamas leaders are running around what is left of the Gaza Strip like rats underground in this sewer tunnel system that they built. And Israel's coming for them.
I remain confident that we will get them. And speaking of Hamas, somehow and for some reason, a lot of the international community and media, obviously not JNS News, has taken the Hamas numbers and have been using Hamas numbers in terms of the casualties in Gaza. But a new analysis published in Tablet magazine by Professor of Statistics and Data Science Abraham Weiner concluded the casualty numbers cited by the Gaza Ministry of Health, with essentially Hamas numbers, are in fact fake. So again, check out this article in Tablet magazine. He said, the professor, the numbers are not real. That much is obvious to anyone who understands how naturally occurring numbers work. Casualties are not overwhelmingly women and children, and the majority may be Hamas fighters. And unfortunately, even the U.S. administration, I think President Biden, if I'm not mistaken, in his State of the Union, or at least the same week, said the majority of casualties in Gaza are women and children. False, according to this report.
Well, Biden said that 30,000 were killed in the State of the Union address. That's when our friend Sid Rosenberg, the host of the morning show in New York City on WABC 770, shouted, "Says who?" and got escorted outside of the room. And when you look at the chart of the number of reported deaths day after day, what you see is it's just a straight line, basically, and there's no such thing as that statistically. But there's a lot of problems with the data. Number one is there's nobody that can verify the data. Okay. Two, that they do not distinguish between Hamas terrorists that are killed and anybody else. They just said the total number of killed. Israel said that they've killed between 11 and 12,000 Hamas operatives. Okay, that's how many they've reported are dead, but they don't even know how many people that they have killed. When you talk about women and children inside Gaza, so a child is defined as anybody under the age of 18, and in some cases they even call it anybody under the age of 19. Now, about 50% of the population in Gaza is under the age of 19, but you can have children, technically, that are also militants, that are terrorists, that have guns, and there are fighters, okay? And we've seen that over and over again in Israel, that terrorists can be under the age of 18. So these numbers are not taking into account, who's being killed that's being specifically targeted. But let's say that you take these numbers at face value, which the tablet article suggests that you can't. Let's say that 30,000 were killed. If Israel's saying that 11,000 were killed because they were fighting, were specifically targeted, that would mean a civilian to combatant ratio of less than 2 to 1. And since the war started, that ratio has shifted lower to be closer to 1 to 1, which is a tremendous, tremendous military achievement when they're fighting against a terrorist organization that operates among civilians.
And people have to remember, this is a war. This is a war. And civilians, and again, we can argue how many civilians are there actually in Gaza? How many are there? You had so many so-called civilians partake in the October 7th massacre, but people have to realize this is a war. Civilians die in war. And Israel does not target civilians as opposed to Hamas, which commits a double war crime when it embeds itself within its own civilian population and then sends rockets, attacks Israel with rockets, and hides in hospitals, hides in daycare centers, hides in schools. So they carry out this double war crime, and Israel taken to task time
and that
time
goes
again.
back to Netanyahu's statement, which is, is the memory of the international community so short, right? People are basically assuming right now that Israel launched this war. Israel did not launch this war. There was a declaration of war on October 7th. Over 3,000 people stormed across the Israeli border and started murdering as many people as they possibly could, killing over 1,200, injuring thousands of others, kidnapping over 250 people, bringing them back into the Gaza Strip. That's a declaration of war. Israel has responded to the war. And I think that what Israel should be saying is all the time that this is not a war that we started, and this war will end when we see all of the Hamas leadership either dead or surrendered, and give them a place where they can come and surrender, and the return of every single last one of our hostages alive and dead. That will end the war. So I think Israel should be saying it over and over again. They did not launch this war, and this war can end when Hamas leaders are dead or surrendered and all the hostages are back.
We didn't start this war. We didn't want this war, but we are going to finish this war. And unfortunately, at the same time, while the focus is on Hamas, of course, in Gaza, a new study came out, shocking, by maybe not so shocking, I don't think it's shocking, by the Regavim movement, which safeguards Israel's state lands. They do tremendous work. This new study shows that the PA security forces, the Palestinian Authority's security apparatus, officers and whatnot, more and more of them are involved in terrorism against Israeli civilians and IDF soldiers. Our very own Carolyn Glick did a whole episode on this on her show, so check it out on JNS TV. But as we saw during the Second Intifada back in 2002, which basically started when the Palestinian Authority security, who were supposed to be fighting Hamas way back then, turned their weapons on their Jewish Israeli soldiers who they were supposed to be doing joint patrols with. They turned their guns on Israel, on the IDF, and on civilians. Once again, more and more PA armed police officers and what have you of the security apparatus are once again using their arms and attacking civilians and soldiers here in Israel.
Well, this is the major threat because you have over 50,000 police officers inside the Palestinian Authority, which are armed and trained as part of the Oslo Accords, and a lot of them receive these arms and training from the United States. And we are seeing over and over and over again, including the shooting of two individuals last week, 2 weeks ago in the city of Eli, that Palestinian Authority police officers are the army of the Palestinian Authority, and the enemy of the Palestinian Authority is not Hamas, which the Palestinian Authority has said that it could in the future form a government together with Hamas. The enemy of the Palestinian Authority is Israel and Israeli Jews. So, there's a big fear that the same way that Hamas organized itself for that October 7th attack, that if this entire paramilitary of the Palestinian Authority, which operates all throughout Judea and Samaria, if they organize that, it doesn't take 50,000. If even 500 of them organize together to commit a deadly attack, they could carry out attacks similar to October 7th anywhere throughout Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, the PA and Hamas might not be best friends. They might not love each other, but the PA certainly has not taken down the Hamas terror infrastructure. And one thing they can agree on is they both want to see the destruction of the state of Israel. They just have different ways of going about it. Hamas, all at once. They want Israel destroyed in one shot, and that's what they tried on October 7th. The Palestinian Authority, they took their time. They signed the Oslo Accords and slowly carried out attacks. They're trying to do it in stages, but it's really two sides of the same coin.
Hamas basically says that a two-state solution is unacceptable because to them, they think that the entire land belongs to the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian Authority, they also believe that the entire state of Israel belongs to the Palestinian people, but they're a little bit more pragmatic in their approach. And they said, well, let's take the first amount that we can get now. And so they're willing to go ahead and to take a two-state solution to canonize a Palestinian state in at least a major chunk of the territory and then use it as the foundation for further attacks against the Jewish people. So it's just a question of strategy and tactics, but the goals of these two organizations, Palestinian Authority, which is Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas, are basically the same.
And even with all these realities, at the end of the day, everyone always wants to talk about peace. Will there be peace? The Biden administration wants a two-state solution, and the majority of Israelis don't want that two-state solution. October 7th was a perfect example of why we cannot turn over additional territory to whether it's the PA, whether it's Hamas taking land over from the PA. But an interesting study here, a survey by the Jewish People Policy Institute, the JPPI, no chance for peace. 5 months after the October attack and the evacuation of northern residents from their homes, the JPPI Institute's March 24th survey reveals the majority of Israelis say there is no chance for peace with the Palestinians in the foreseeable future. And we have some statistics here. But again, especially after October 7th, people in Israel are not optimistic that our neighbors want to live side by side with us in peace.
Yeah, this is really important. It said that 79% of Jews that were polled said that there's no chance of reaching a peace agreement in the foreseeable future. So this goes back to the beginning of the program where we talk about the Biden administration wanting Israel to go ahead with a Palestinian state and thinking that if only they get Netanyahu out of the way, that they can get toward a Palestinian state. Here, the JPPI, which is not a fan of Netanyahu, okay, this is not a right-wing or Likud-supporting institute. This is a left-wing institute that wants Netanyahu out. But they come forward with a survey that shows that 79%. I mean, this isn't close. Okay, 79% of Jews and also 39% of Israeli Arabs, all saying that there's no process that's going to happen anytime in the foreseeable future for a two-state solution, which basically validates what Netanyahu is saying, that these are not his policies opposing a Palestinian state. This is the entire country opposing a Palestinian state. But there's also a few other very interesting findings here. The second is that 63% of Israelis believe that Israel should attack Hezbollah to the north, that they understand that what happened on October 7th could happen in the north from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they're not willing to live alongside this terror threat anymore. 63% saying that Israel should attack. The only question being whether they should attack right now and open up a multi-front war, or should they wait until the hostilities are finished, the operation is done in Gaza, and then go into the north.
We have threats to the south, threats to the north, potential threats to the east with Iran, of course. Alex, there's one additional statistic here that I think that's important that I want you to go ahead and share, please.
Right. It's a question of who is responsible for October 7th, because we've been hearing all kinds of complaints that Netanyahu is responsible. There's billboards across Israel that with pictures of Netanyahu that say Ata Rosh, Ata Hashem, you are the head, you are guilty, right? And the question of who does Israel hold responsible for October 7th? Do they hold the government and Netanyahu responsible? Do they hold the IDF responsible? Do they hold the Mossad and the other security establishment responsible? So on the issue of taking responsibility for the October 7th failure, the JPPI survey says that 44% of the Israeli public believes that the government, the IDF, and the Shin Bet share equal and joint responsibility, And they go on to show that only 20% of the country believes that the responsibility for the failure lies only with the government. So when you hear calls for Netanyahu to resign, it's very clear that Israelis are not going to be comfortable if only Netanyahu resigns. Is the chief of staff of the military going to resign? And you heard Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, attacking the IDF chief of staff for his culpability in October 7th just yesterday, which received a lot of criticism, but that's where Israelis feel. Will the head of the Mossad, will the head of the Shin Bet, which is Israel's equivalent of the FBI, will they all step down? Will all the generals step down? So, you only hear Schumer and others saying that Netanyahu needs to be replaced. Israelis are saying that the responsibility for October 7th is across the board.
Again, I understand that these surveys come out, and they come out, often in terms of trying to gauge people's opinions on how the war is going and what should happen once the war is over. And I personally am of the opinion that we should try to push these issues aside right now, finish the war, defeat Hamas, get back the hostages, make sure Gaza is not a threat anymore. And then, obviously, we will have to really take a good, hard look in the mirror and figure out exactly how this tremendous failure came about.
And I think that the JPPI would demonstrate that most Israelis agree with that view, which is that we are fighting a war. There will be a time for review. There will certainly be a tremendous commission of inquiry into what happened. I'm sure it's going to be damning up and down across the board. And Israelis are hoping that there will be a new leadership, but it's not just a political leadership. It's a security leadership. It's a whole way of thinking. The whole concept of Oslo, as you mentioned, led to October 7th. The whole concept of evacuating Gush Katif led to October 7th. The whole idea of saying that we can live alongside them even if they're building weapons and tunnels and rockets, that they're not going to attack us. That led to October 7th. So there was a lot of misconception, and it's systemic. It's systemic misconception, and Israelis are going to have to come to terms with that, but not in the middle of the war.
With all this going on, Alex, we are approaching the spring Jewish holiday season, so to speak. We have the holiday of Purim, which is a joyous day on the Jewish calendar coming up. For most of the world, it's going to be Saturday night, Sunday. In Jerusalem, it's special. It's going to be Sunday night, Monday. And it really is a celebration from thousands of years ago when another enemy decided they wanted to try to wipe out the Jewish people, and we survived and we celebrate. And, as they say, they try to kill us, and we eat, we feast, I think this year is going to be a little bit different, maybe a little bit more subdued, unfortunately, as a result of the situation. But, we still have to keep Purim. We have to celebrate this joyous occasion.
Yeah, and the book of, the story of Purim is told in the book of Esther. So I definitely recommend that anybody pick up the book of Esther and read it. It only takes a few minutes to read this incredible story. But just to summarize, you had this evil viceroy, Haman, that went to the king of the Persians at the time, Ahasuerus. He wanted the Jews dead. He had the king sign a decree which said that basically the entire society, which was 127 nations of that empire, could turn on the Jewish people and kill them. Esther and Mordecai came along, and Esther became the queen, and she did whatever she could to conspire to overthrow Haman. And essentially what happened was the decree was turned where Ahasuerus signed into law that the Jews could fight back. So it wasn't that the decree was canceled, that the Jewish people were given the royal right to fight back, and they did fight back, and they killed their accusers. They won the war, and like you said, then we celebrate and we feast. So certainly there are connections between what happened in the holiday of Purim and today, and we should hope that the same way that Israel did not declare this war, that rather the enemies of the Jewish people declared it, and we see that it's the entire world turning on the Jewish people in the state of Israel, that Israel will be victorious in the war, and at the end, Israelis will celebrate, and we'll have another feast where we can eat because we're hungry.
Haman, Hania, either one, at the end of the day, we shall prevail. I'm very optimistic about that. And that's all the time we have for today. For those celebrating the holiday of Purim, hopefully it will be a joyous one, a quiet one, a festive one. Only good things for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. This is Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. Josh Hasten along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Big shout out to Ryan Lifshitz, who's behind the scenes here. Without Ryan, none of this happens, folks. So big shout out to Ryan. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and happy Purim, and continue to pray for the welfare of the state of Israel and our brave IDF soldiers who are on the front lines. Only good things. Check out all the great content on jns.org that we have to offer Israel, the Middle East. It's all there, folks. Check it out. Have a great week, everybody.